Nobody at Thornwell hold wanted the runt. I did. I ran the mess block on the lower ring, third shift, feeding whatever came through the door. Guards, prisoners, the handlers who worked the Kelvin pens down in Bay 4. Thornwell was a labor station bolted into a dead rock past the frontier line, and its whole economy ran on ore, debt, and fear, in roughly that order. The fear came from the pens. Director Soren Kellner had spent 6 years and most of the station's black budget breeding a line of alien apex predators he called compliance beasts. Hulking, bare-shouldered, dog-jawed things bred out of a species the survey charts listed as Kelvin, native to some frozen moon nobody had bothered to name. Kellner didn't want pets. He wanted a threat he could point at a work stoppage and watch it end. The runt came out of a litter of 6, smallest by half, passed over by the handlers who only wanted the biggest and meanest for training. Bay 4 didn't feed what it didn't plan to use. I did. I brought it scraps off the line, fat trimmed from the ration meat, bone ends nobody wanted, and I fed it through the bars the way you'd feed a stray dog back on a real world, without ceremony, without looking at it like it was a weapon someone forgot to load. I called it Barrow, because it dug like one, and because it never had a name that wasn't a designation number stenciled on a cage card. The handlers thought I was an idiot. Maybe I was. I wasn't scared of it, and in a place like Thornwell, not being scared of the right things gets you talked about. But Barrow ate what I brought and went quiet when I was near. And quiet was the one thing that species never went. I'd stand at the bars some nights after the mess closed, and it would press its skull against my hand through the gap, patient as a stone, and I'd tell it was going to be somebody's problem someday, and it should enjoy the scraps while it lasted. It grew faster than the handler's chart said it should. By the time the other 5 had gone through combat conditioning, the shock collars, the growl drills, the staged hunts they ran to sharpen the pack's aggression, Barrow had outgrown all of them, and outgrown the pack alpha, a scarred brute named Galt that every handler in Bay 4 was privately terrified of. Barrow wasn't trained the way the others were. Barrow was fed. There's a difference, and I think that difference is the only reason any of what happened next happened at all. The unrest had been building on the labor decks for months before it had a name. Ration cuts, quota hikes, 2 men dead in a tunnel collapse that management logged as equipment failure. By midsummer, the prisoners on the lower decks had stopped working in shifts and started working in silence, which is worse, and everyone with rank on that station knew it. Kellner called it an uprising before it was won, because that word justified what he wanted to do about it, which was march the Kelvin pack up through the labor decks in full harness and let 300 exhausted men look at 6 apex predators bred to kill on command and decide the quota wasn't worth dying over. I heard the plan before most people did, because cooks hear everything. I kept feeding Barrow anyway. What was I going to do, starve it into agreeing with me? The day it happened, I was hauling a cart of morning rations down the lower corridor when the alarm started. Not the fire klaxon, the other one. The one that meant lockdown, meant Kellner had pulled the trigger on his own station. I heard the pens open 3 decks up. I heard the sound a crowd makes when it realizes it's about to be hunted, which isn't screaming, not at first. It's silence. The same silence the labor decks had been practicing for months, just colder. I didn't run. I want to say that was courage. Mostly it was that I had a cart of bread rolls in my hands and nowhere useful to put them down. The pack came around the corridor bend at a dead run, Galt in the lead, 5 more behind him, harnessed and handled by 2 enforcement officers, who looked considerably less confident than the plan on paper had probably promised them they'd feel. Behind the pack came the prisoners, backed against the far wall, 300 men with nowhere to go and nothing in their hands but tools they'd been carrying when the alarm caught them. And behind all of it came Barrow, off the leash line, because no handler on that station had ever managed to keep a leash on something that size. Galt reached the front of the crowd first and stopped. Not attacked, stopped, the way a hunting animal stops when its nose tells it something its eyes haven't caught up to yet. The rest of the pack piled up behind him, uncertain, snarling at nothing in particular the way animals do, when the order they were given doesn't match the situation in front of them. Barrow came through the pack like it wasn't there, and stood in front of me. Not beside me. In front of me, between me and the corridor, big enough now that I had to look up to find its eyes, and I heard one of the enforcement officers say something into his comm that wasn't in the manual, something closer to a prayer. Easy, I told it. Same thing I'd said through the bars 100 nights running. Easy, big fella. It didn't lie down. It didn't come to heel. It turned its skull toward Galt and made a sound low in its chest that I felt in the cart handle before I heard it. And Galt, 6 years of conditioning, a whole program built on that animal's aggression, took 1 step back, then another, then sat, which I later learned was a thing that species did only in front of something it had already decided it wasn't going to fight. Kellner arrived at a run, 3 more officers behind him, and took in the scene in about a second and a half. His flagship compliance unit sitting on its haunches in front of a cook with a cart of bread rolls, and the second largest predator he'd ever bred standing between that cook and every gun on the deck. "Move it," he said to Barrow, and then, when nothing moved, said it again, louder. The way men say things twice when the first time already told them the answer. Barrow didn't look at him. It looked at the crowd of prisoners along the wall, then back at Kellner, and made a sound that wasn't a growl exactly. Flatter than that, more final. The kind of sound a door makes when it decides it isn't opening again. Kellner's hand went to the harness control on his belt, the failsafe that was supposed to drop any compliance unit that broke command. I watched him thumb it twice. Nothing happened. Later I heard the handlers argue for a week about whether the collar had failed or whether Barrow had simply grown past the point the collar was built for. I never much cared which. What I cared about was the look on Kellner's face in the second and a half it took him to understand that the weapon he'd built to end an uprising was now the reason his own men weren't moving either. His officers had guns, not one of them raised one. You don't point a rifle at something that just made your own attack dog sit down and apologize with its eyes. "Stand down," I said, not to Barrow, to Kellner, which is a strange thing for a cook to say to a director, and I said it anyway. Quiet, the same tone I used on the runt through the bars. Kellner looked at 300 men who weren't backing down, 6 predators who weren't obeying him, and 1 unarmed cook standing calm in the middle of all of it like the whole thing was a supply delay, and something in his face just gave, not fear exactly. The particular collapse of a man who has just watched his own leverage walk away from him and sit down at somebody else's feet. He didn't order the guns raised. I think he knew by then it wouldn't matter. He turned and left the corridor at something just short of a run, and his officers went with him, and none of them looked back at the pack on their way out. Thornwell changed hands quietly after that. New administration, an actual quota review, the kind of thing that happens when 300 men and 6 apex predators agree on something without ever discussing it out loud. Nobody wrote a doctrine about it. Nobody needed to. Barrow still comes by the mess block most evenings, too big for the doorway now, and sits while I finish the last of the trays. Galt comes sometimes too, keeps a respectful distance. The old alpha deferring to something it never quite has words for. I still feed them scraps off the line. Still no ceremony to it. It was never about ceremony. It was about being the one man on that whole cold rock who fed something before he needed it to be useful, and letting the rest sort itself out from there.